I never imagined that sorting through my mother's belongings after her funeral would unravel a secret she carried for 76 years. Among faded photographs and worn letters, I found documents that revealed she wasn't just my quiet, gentle mother who made the best miso soup in Iowa. She was part of a movement that changed American immigration law forever, and she never told me. My name is Lorraine Caldwell. I'm 77 years old now, and this is the story of my mother, Fumiko Nakamura, who became Fumiko Caldwell in 1946 when she married my father, Warren, a U.S. Army sergeant stationed in occupied Japan. For most of my life, I knew only fragments of her past. She spoke little about Japan, rarely mentioned her family, and whenever I asked about her journey to America, she would smile softly and say, "It was a long time ago, Lorraine. The past is the past." But the past, I discovered, was never really past. It was alive in every letter she saved, every document she hid, every sacrifice she made in silence. It was there in the way she folded origami cranes when she was anxious, in the Japanese lullabies she hummed when she thought no one was listening, in the careful way she wrapped gifts with precision that seemed excessive until I understood it was a link to a culture she had left behind. The story begins in August 1945, when the war that had consumed the world for 6 years finally ended. Japan surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and American forces arrived to occupy the defeated nation. My mother was 20 years old then, living in what remained of Tokyo after the firebombing campaigns had turned much of the city into ash and rubble. The night of March 9, 1945 had been the worst. American B-29 bombers had dropped incendiary bombs across the city, creating a firestorm that killed over 100,000 people in a single night. My mother had survived by fleeing to a canal and submerging herself in the freezing water while the city burned around her. Her father had died in an air raid in 1945, crushed under the collapsed roof of their home while trying to save family photographs. Her mother succumbed to illness and malnutrition shortly after, her body simply giving up after months of starvation and grief. Fumiko and her older brother Isamu were left alone in a country that had lost everything, a country where children begged in the streets, where people traded family heirlooms for a handful of rice, where the proud empire had been reduced to rubble and desperation. Isamu had been a soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army. He returned from the war with a shattered leg, courtesy of shrapnel from an American grenade during the Battle of Okinawa, and a spirit even more broken. He rarely spoke about what he had seen, but the nightmares that woke him screaming in the night told Fumiko enough. He would wake up shouting orders to men who were long dead, or crying out warnings about incoming artillery. Some nights, Fumiko would find him sitting by the window, staring out at nothing, his hands trembling uncontrollably. They lived in a single room in a building that had somehow survived the bombings, sharing space with 3 other families. Privacy was non-existent. They hung blankets to create makeshift walls, but sound traveled freely, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Food was scarce, work was scarcer. Fumiko took any job she could find, washing clothes in the icy river until her hands cracked and bled, cleaning debris from bombed-out buildings for a few yen, standing in lines for rations that never seemed to be enough. Some days, their only meal was a thin soup made from vegetable scraps and whatever grain they could get. The black market thrived in those days. American cigarettes, chocolate, and canned goods were currency. Fumiko saw women trading their bodies for food, saw children stealing from the dead, saw the complete collapse of the social order that had once defined Japanese society. She was propositioned more times than she could count, by American soldiers, by Japanese men with connections, by anyone who thought a young woman alone was desperate enough to do anything for survival. But Fumiko had made a promise to her mother before she died. "Keep your dignity," her mother had whispered, her voice barely audible. "No matter what happens, keep your dignity. That is something they cannot take from you unless you give it away." Fumiko held on to those words like a lifeline. In early 1946, she heard that the American occupation forces were hiring Japanese civilians to work on the military bases. The pay was better than anything available in the civilian economy, and the work came with meals, actual meals with meat and vegetables and bread. Fumiko applied and was assigned to work in the mess hall at a base in western Tokyo, serving food to American soldiers. The application process had been humiliating. She had to be photographed, fingerprinted, and subjected to a medical examination that felt invasive and degrading. American officials asked her questions about her family, about whether anyone had been involved in the military, about her political beliefs. But she endured it because the alternative was starvation. That's where she met my father. Warren Caldwell was 23 years old, a sergeant from a small town in Iowa called Maquoketa. He had joined the Army in 1942, right after Pearl Harbor, driven by a mixture of patriotism and a desire to escape the monotony of farm life. He fought in the Pacific Theater, island hopping through some of the bloodiest battles of the war. He had been at Guadalcanal, where he watched friends die from disease and Japanese bullets. He had been at Saipan, where he saw civilians throw themselves off cliffs rather than surrender. He had been at Iwo Jima, where the volcanic sand and constant artillery fire created a hell that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. By the time he arrived in Tokyo for occupation duty in late 1945, he was tired of war, tired of death, tired of seeing the world as an endless series of enemies. He had killed men, watched men die, and done things that he would never fully describe to anyone. He wanted to believe in something good again, wanted to see humanity as more than just targets and threats. He noticed Fumiko immediately. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with delicate features and eyes that seemed to carry an ocean of sadness. She moved through the mess hall with a grace that seemed out of place in the chaos of military life, serving food with a quiet efficiency that never drew attention to itself. Most of the Japanese workers kept their heads down, avoided eye contact, and moved through their duties like ghosts. But there was something different about Fumiko. Despite everything, despite the defeat and the poverty and the humiliation, she carried herself with a dignity that Warren found captivating. He started coming to the serving line when he knew she would be working. At first, he just smiled. She didn't smile back. She would ladle food onto his tray, nod politely, and move on to the next soldier. Then he learned a few words of Japanese from a phrase book he bought at the base exchange. Konnichiwa, he would say, his pronunciation terrible. Arigatou gozaimasu. She would nod politely and move on to the next soldier. But he thought he saw the faintest flicker of amusement in her eyes at his mangled Japanese. Warren was persistent. He started bringing her small things, a chocolate bar left on the counter where she worked, an apple placed carefully next to her coat, a pair of gloves when winter came and he noticed her hands were red and chapped from the cold. Fumiko was suspicious at first. She had heard stories about American soldiers and Japanese women, stories that didn't end well, stories of women who were used and discarded, of promises made and broken, of children born and abandoned. Some of the women who worked on the base had become involved with soldiers and were now shunned by Japanese society, labeled as pan-pan girls, prostitutes, even if the relationships had been genuine. But Warren was different. He was patient. He didn't demand anything. He didn't make crude gestures or propositions like some of the other soldiers. He just wanted to talk. He would come to the mess hall during off hours when it was quiet and sit at a table near where she was cleaning. He would practice his Japanese, and she would occasionally correct his pronunciation. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to respond. Their conversations were clumsy at first, a mixture of broken English, broken Japanese, and a lot of hand gestures. Warren would draw pictures to explain concepts. Fumiko would write kanji characters and try to explain their meanings. They communicated as much through silence and shared glances as through words. But slowly, they found a language that worked, a language built on patience and genuine interest in understanding each other. Warren told her about Iowa, about cornfields that stretched to the horizon in every direction, about a river called the Mississippi that was so wide you couldn't see the other side, about a life that seemed impossibly distant from the ruins of Tokyo. He described county fairs with prize-winning pigs, Friday night high school football games, church socials where everyone brought a covered dish, and summer evenings catching fireflies. He painted a picture of a world that was peaceful, abundant, and impossibly foreign to Fumiko. Fumiko told him about Japan before the war, about cherry blossoms in spring that turned entire hillsides pink and white, about festivals where people wore beautiful kimonos and watched fireworks over the river, about her father who had been a school teacher and would recite classical poetry to his students. She described tea ceremonies where every movement had meaning, New Year celebrations with special foods that symbolized good fortune, and the sound of temple bells ringing across the city at dusk. She told him about a world that no longer existed, a world that had been destroyed by the same war that had brought him to Japan. They fell in love. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was gradual, built on small moments, shared silences, and the quiet understanding that they had both survived something terrible and wanted to believe in something better. Warren found himself thinking about Fumiko constantly, counting the hours until he could see her again. Fumiko found herself looking forward to Warren's visits, found herself caring about her appearance in a way she hadn't since before the war, found herself imagining a future that didn't involve poverty and ruins. When Warren told Fumiko he wanted to marry her, it was during a walk along the Sumida River in the spring of 1946. Cherry blossoms were blooming, one of the few beautiful things that had survived the war. He had been practicing the words in Japanese for weeks, but when the moment came, he said them in English, afraid his pronunciation would ruin the moment. Fumiko, I love you. I want you to be my wife. I want to take you to America and build a life with you. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the river, at the cherry blossoms, at the ruins of the city beyond. She knew what it would mean. She would have to leave Japan, leave Isamu, leave everything she had ever known. She would be going to a country that had been her enemy, to live among people who might never accept her. She would be leaving behind her parents' graves, the language she thought in, the culture that defined her, and there was no guarantee that the American military would even allow the marriage. Regulations were complicated. Permissions were hard to get, and even if they could marry, immigration laws made it nearly impossible for Japanese women to enter the United States. But when she looked at Warren, at his earnest face and hopeful eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time: possibility. She saw a man who looked at her not as a defeated enemy, not as a desperate woman, but as someone worthy of love and respect. She saw a chance at a life that wasn't defined by loss and poverty. She took his hand and said in careful English, "Yes, I will marry you." But Warren was determined to do this properly. He went to his commanding officer, Colonel Harlan Whitmore, and requested permission to marry. Whitmore was a career military man, 55 years old, with a face like carved granite and a belief that fraternization between American soldiers and Japanese civilians was a bad idea that would lead to nothing but trouble. He had seen too many soldiers make impulsive decisions during wartime, decisions they regretted when they got home. He denied the request immediately, barely looking up from the paperwork on his desk. "Request denied, Sergeant. You're young, you're far from home, and you're confusing loneliness with love. When you get back to the States, you'll realize this was a mistake. Move on." Warren didn't give up. He filed appeal after appeal, gathering letters of recommendation from other officers, character references from fellow soldiers, and documentation of his exemplary service record. He found other soldiers who had married or wanted to marry Japanese women and discovered that they were all facing the same bureaucratic wall. The military didn't officially forbid these marriages, but it didn't make them easy either. There were investigations, interviews, psychological evaluations, and endless paperwork designed to discourage soldiers from going through with it. Warren became something of a crusader. He organized meetings with other soldiers in similar situations. They compared notes, shared strategies, and supported each other through the frustrating process. Some of the men gave up, worn down by the bureaucracy, or transferred to other posts. But Warren was stubborn. He had survived 3 years of combat. He wasn't going to let paperwork defeat him. Meanwhile, Fumiko faced opposition from her own side. When she told Isamu that she wanted to marry an American soldier, he exploded in rage. They were in their small room, separated from the other families only by thin blankets. Everyone in the building heard the argument. "Have you forgotten what they did to us?" Isamu shouted, his voice raw with fury. "They burned our cities. They killed our father. They dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They destroyed everything we were, everything we believed in. And now you want to marry one of them? You want to go to their country and pretend that none of this happened?" Fumiko tried to explain that Warren was not the enemy, that the war was over, that they had to find a way to move forward. "The war is over, brother. We lost. Hating them won't bring father back. It won't rebuild Tokyo. It won't give us our lives back. Warren is a good man. He treats me with respect. He wants to build a future, not dwell on the past." But Isamu couldn't hear it. He had lost too much, suffered too much. His leg ached constantly, a permanent reminder of the war. He had nightmares every night. He had watched friends die, had killed enemy soldiers, had believed he was fighting for the emperor and the glory of Japan, only to learn that it had all been for nothing. The idea that his sister would marry an American felt like a betrayal of everything he had fought for, everyone who had died. "If you do this," he said, his voice cold and final, "you are no longer my sister. You are dead to me, just like our parents." It was the worst conversation of Fumiko's life. She loved her brother. He was the only family she had left. They had survived the war together, had kept each other alive through the worst of the bombing and the starvation. But she also loved Warren, and she believed that marrying him was her chance at a life that wasn't defined by loss and poverty and endless grief. She moved out of the room they shared and found space with another family, sleeping on the floor in a corner of their room. Isamu didn't speak to her for months. When they passed each other on the street, he would look away, his jaw set, his eyes hard. In the summer of 1946, Warren's persistence finally paid off. Colonel Whitmore, perhaps worn down by the constant requests or perhaps recognizing that these marriages were going to happen whether the military liked it or not, approved Warren's application. There were conditions, of course. Warren had to attend counseling sessions about the challenges of intercultural marriage. He had to provide financial documentation proving he could support a wife. He had to get letters from his family back home, stating they were aware of and supported the marriage. His mother's letter had been brief and cold, but it was enough to satisfy the military requirements. Warren and Fumiko were married in a small civil ceremony at the base in September 1946. There were no guests from Fumiko's side. Isamu refused to attend. Fumiko wore a simple dress that Warren had bought for her. Not a traditional white wedding gown, but a modest blue dress that made her feel pretty for the first time in years. Warren wore his dress uniform. The ceremony was conducted by a military chaplain who spoke in a monotone and seemed eager to finish and move on to his next appointment. There was no reception, no celebration, just a brief exchange of vows and a kiss that felt both thrilling and terrifying to Fumiko. But getting married was only the first hurdle. The bigger problem was getting Fumiko into the United States. American immigration law in 1946 was still governed by racial quotas established in the Immigration Act of 1924, which effectively banned Asian immigration. The law was based on the belief that Asians were racially inferior and could never assimilate into American society. The War Brides Act, passed in December 1945, allowed foreign wives of American servicemen to enter the country outside the normal quota system, but it initially didn't apply to Japanese women because of the racial restrictions embedded in earlier legislation. Warren and Fumiko spent months navigating a legal maze that seemed designed to defeat them. They filled out forms, dozens of them, each one requiring documentation that was difficult or impossible to obtain in a country still recovering from total war. They attended interviews where Fumiko was asked invasive questions about her family, her background, her intentions. Immigration officials seemed suspicious of her motives, treating her as if she were a spy or a gold digger, rather than a woman in love. Warren was eventually reassigned back to the United States in early 1947, his tour of duty in Japan complete. Fumiko had to stay behind, waiting for her immigration papers to be processed. The separation was agonizing. Warren left Japan in February 1947, and neither of them knew when or if they would see each other again. It was during this separation that Fumiko wrote letters, dozens of them. Letters to Warren, pouring out her loneliness and fear. Letters to American immigration officials pleading for understanding. Letters to congressmen arguing for justice. Letters to anyone who might be able to help. She wrote late at night, by candlelight, using paper that Warren had left her, and carefully rationing the ink. In one of these letters, which I found in the box after her funeral, she wrote, "I am not asking for special treatment. I am asking to be with my husband. I am asking to be seen as a human being, not as a member of an enemy race. The war is over. Can we not also end the hatred? I understand that Americans suffered because of Japan. I understand that there is anger and pain, but I did not start the war. I did not bomb Pearl Harbor. I am just a woman who wants to be with the man she loves. Is that so wrong?" Her words were part of a growing chorus. Thousands of American servicemen had married Japanese women during the occupation, and they were all facing the same impossible situation. Their wives couldn't join them in America, because of laws that treated them as racially undesirable. The pressure mounted. Soldiers wrote to their representatives. Families lobbied for change. Newspapers began covering the stories of these separated couples, running photographs of lonely soldiers holding pictures of their wives, of Japanese women waiting in limbo, of children born who might never see their fathers. The American public, which had been so united in hatred of Japan during the war, began to soften. These weren't faceless enemies anymore. They were wives, mothers, human beings caught in an impossible situation. Veterans organizations began advocating for changes to the law. Churches and civic groups took up the cause. The war brides became a symbol of the need for reconciliation and healing after the devastation of the war. In July 1947, Congress passed an amendment to the War Brides Act that finally allowed Japanese wives of American servicemen to immigrate to the United States. It was a small change in the law, a technical amendment that most Americans probably never heard about, but it represented a massive shift in American attitudes toward race and immigration. For the first time in decades, the principle that Asians could never become Americans was officially challenged and defeated. Fumiko received her approval in August 1947. The notification came in the form of an official letter delivered to the address where she was staying. She read it 3 times, unable to believe it was real. She was going to America. She was going to be with Warren. After months of waiting and uncertainty, it was finally happening. She boarded a military transport ship in Yokohama with dozens of other Japanese war brides, all of them heading toward an uncertain future. The ship was not designed for passenger comfort. The women were housed in converted cargo holds, sleeping in bunks stacked 3 high. The journey across the Pacific took 2 weeks. Many of the women were seasick, spending days curled up in their bunks, unable to keep food down. Some were terrified, crying at night, wondering if they had made a terrible mistake. Others were excited, talking about the lives they would build in America, the homes they would have, the children they would raise. Fumiko was all of those things at once. She spent hours on deck, watching the ocean, thinking about everything she was leaving behind. She thought about her parents, buried in a cemetery in Tokyo that she might never see again. She thought about Isamu, wondered if he would ever forgive her, wondered if she would ever see him again. She thought about Japan, the country of her birth, the language of her soul, the culture that had shaped her. She was leaving all of it behind for a man she had known for less than 2 years, for a country she had never seen, for a future that was completely unknown. Before she left, she had gone to see Isamu one last time. She found him at the small apartment he had moved into, a single room even more cramped than the one they had shared. He was working as a carpenter, using his skills to help rebuild the city. His legs still bothered him and he walked with a pronounced limp, but he was surviving. She knocked on his door. He opened it and stared at her for a long moment without speaking. "You're really going?" he said finally. It wasn't a question. She nodded. "I leave in 3 days. Will I ever see you again?" She didn't know how to answer. International travel was expensive, prohibitively so for people like them. Letters would take weeks to arrive. The distance between Japan and America was not just physical, but cultural, political, almost unbridgeable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden charm, a protective amulet that their mother had given him before he went to war. It was carved in the shape of a crane, symbol of longevity and good fortune. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her hand. "Mother gave it to me to keep me safe. I survived the war. Maybe it will keep you safe too." Fumiko's eyes filled with tears. "Brother, don't forget where you came from," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't let them make you forget who you are. You're Japanese, Fumiko. No matter what passport you carry, no matter what name you take, you're Japanese. Remember that." She hugged him then, and he hugged her back, both of them crying. It was the last time she would see him in person. They would write letters for the next 4 decades, but they would never stand in the same room again. Fumiko arrived in San Francisco in September 1947. The ship docked at a military facility, and the war brides were processed through immigration. It was a chaotic scene, dozens of women with limited English trying to navigate an overwhelming bureaucracy, while military officials checked documents and directed them to various processing stations. Some of the women were met by their husbands at the dock. Others had to travel onward to different parts of the country, Warren was waiting for her. She barely recognized him in his civilian clothes, a simple shirt and trousers instead of his uniform. But when she saw his face, his smile, the way his eyes lit up when he spotted her, all her fears melted away. They held each other for a long time, neither of them speaking, both of them crying. Around them, other couples were reuniting, creating a scene of joy and relief and overwhelming emotion. "You're here," Warren kept saying. "You're really here. I was so afraid something would go wrong, that they would change their minds, that I would lose you." "I'm here," Fumiko said, her English still heavily accented but clearer than it had been. She had been studying during the months they were apart, determined to be able to communicate better with Warren and his family. From San Francisco, they traveled by train to Iowa. The journey took 3 days, crossing mountains and deserts and endless plains. Fumiko had never seen anything like the American landscape. The vastness of it was overwhelming. In Japan, space was precious, every inch of land cultivated or built upon. But here there were miles and miles of nothing but open land. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Warren tried to prepare her for what to expect. "Maquoketa is small," he said. "Really small. About 5,000 people. Everyone knows everyone. They're good people, but they've never seen anyone like you. You might be the first Japanese person most of them have ever met." Fumiko nodded, trying to steel herself for what was coming. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She had heard stories from other war brides about the reception they received in America, about the stares and whispers, about the outright hostility in some places. Warren's mother, Opal Caldwell, was waiting for them at the train station in Maquoketa. Opal was 52 years old, a widow who had lost her husband to a heart attack in 1943. She had not been happy when Warren wrote to tell her he had married a Japanese woman. Her letters back to him had been cold, formal, full of warnings about what the neighbors would think, about how difficult it would be, about whether he had really thought this through. She had lost friends in the war, had read about Japanese atrocities, had been taught to see the Japanese as cruel and inhuman enemies. But when Fumiko stepped off the train, small and exhausted and clearly terrified, something shifted in Opal. She had been prepared to meet an enemy, perhaps a cunning woman who had trapped her son. Instead, she saw a young woman far from home, trying to make a life in a place that didn't want her. She saw someone who needed help, and Opal had spent her whole life helping people. Opal stepped forward, took Fumiko's hand, and said, "Welcome home." Those 2 words meant everything. Fumiko's eyes filled with tears. She bowed deeply, a Japanese gesture of respect and gratitude, and said, "Thank you, Mother." It wasn't easy. The neighbors did talk. Some people in town refused to speak to Fumiko. When she walked down Main Street, conversations would stop. People would stare, some with curiosity, some with hostility. Children sometimes followed her on the street, pointing and whispering, mimicking her accent. There were moments when Fumiko wanted to get back on a train, get on a ship and return to Japan, even if it meant living in poverty and ruins. The local newspaper ran a story about Warren bringing home a Japanese bride, and the response was mixed. Some people wrote letters to the editor expressing support, saying that the war was over and it was time to move forward. Others wrote angry letters saying that Warren had betrayed his country, that Japanese people could never be trusted, that Fumiko should be sent back where she came from. One day, Fumiko went to the grocery store alone, trying to be independent, trying to learn how to navigate this new world. The store owner, an older man named Mr. Peterson, refused to serve her. "We don't serve Japs here," he said loudly, making sure everyone in the store could hear. Fumiko left, humiliated, fighting back tears. When Warren heard about it, he was furious. He went to the store and confronted Mr. Peterson. "That's my wife you insulted," he said, his voice tight with anger. "She's an American citizen's wife and she deserves to be treated with respect. If you ever speak to her that way again, you'll answer to me." Mr. Peterson backed down, muttering an apology, but the damage was done. Fumiko felt like an outsider, like she would never belong. But Warren was there, and Opal was there, and slowly, very slowly, Fumiko began to build a life. Opal taught her about American cooking, about how to make pot roast and apple pie. Fumiko taught Opal about Japanese food, about how to make rice properly, about the delicate flavors of miso soup and pickled vegetables. They spent hours in the kitchen together, Two women from completely different worlds finding common ground in the universal language of food. Fumiko learned English, studying late into the night, listening to the radio to improve her pronunciation, reading newspapers and books. She would always speak with an accent, but her vocabulary grew, and she became more confident in her ability to communicate. She got a job at a local fabric store, where her skill with sewing and embroidery impressed the owner, a woman named Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson had lost a son in the war, and at first, she was reluctant to hire Fumiko. But she needed help, and Fumiko's skills were undeniable. Over time, Mrs. Henderson came to appreciate Fumiko's quiet competence, her attention to detail, her willingness to work hard. Fumiko made a few friends, other women who were willing to look past her nationality and see her for who she was. There was Sarah, a young mother who lived next door, who brought over a casserole the day Fumiko and Warren moved into their small house. There was Ruth, who attended the same church and invited Fumiko to join the ladies' auxiliary. There was Margaret, who worked at the library and helped Fumiko find books to improve her English. These friendships were tentative at first, built on polite conversations and small gestures, but over time they deepened. Fumiko helped Sarah with sewing projects. Ruth taught Fumiko about American holidays and traditions. Margaret introduced Fumiko to American literature, and Fumiko shared Japanese poetry and stories. In 1948, I was born. My arrival changed everything. Suddenly, Fumiko wasn't just a Japanese war bride. She was a mother. And in a small town like Makwakera, being a mother meant something. The women who had been cold to her started offering advice about child rearing. The neighbors who had stared began stopping by with casseroles and baby clothes. I became the bridge between my mother and the community. My birth was difficult. Fumiko was in labor for 18 hours and there were complications. The doctor, an older man who had initially been skeptical about treating her, worked tirelessly to ensure both she and I survived. When I was finally born, healthy and crying, he handed me to Fumiko with tears in his eyes. "She's beautiful," he said. "Congratulations." Warren was overjoyed. He had been terrified throughout the pregnancy, afraid that something would go wrong, that he would lose Fumiko or the baby or both. But when he held me for the first time, all his fears melted away. "She's perfect," he kept saying. "She's absolutely perfect." They named me Lorraine after Warren's grandmother, a woman who had been known for her kindness and strength. Fumiko wanted to give me a Japanese middle name, but Warren was worried it would make my life harder. "Let's give her every advantage we can," he said. "Let's make it as easy as possible for her to fit in." Fumiko agreed, though part of her mourned the loss of that connection to her heritage. She wrote to Isamu, telling him about my birth, sending photographs. His response came months later, a brief letter expressing congratulations and a tentative hope that perhaps one day he would meet me. Growing up, I was aware that my mother was different. I looked different too, with features that marked me as mixed race in a town that was almost entirely white. My eyes were not quite round, not quite almond-shaped. My hair was dark and straight. My skin tone was somewhere between my father's paleness and my mother's olive complexion. There were times when other kids teased me, called me names, asked why my mother talked funny, asked if she was a spy, but my father taught me to be proud of who I was. "You're special, Lorraine," he would say. "You have the best of both worlds. You're American and you're Japanese, and that makes you unique." My mother taught me resilience through her example. She never complained about the prejudice she faced. She never spoke bitterly about the people who rejected her. She just kept moving forward, kept working, kept being kind even when kindness wasn't returned. Fumiko rarely talked about Japan. When I asked about her family, she would say they were gone. When I asked about the war, she would change the subject. She focused entirely on the present, on being the best mother and wife she could be. She volunteered at my school, attended every parent-teacher conference, made costumes for school plays, and cheered at every softball game I played. She baked cookies for school fundraisers, hosted Girl Scout meetings at our house, and became known in the community as someone who could be counted on. But there were moments when I saw the sadness in her. Late at night, I would sometimes hear her crying softly in the kitchen. I would find her holding letters written in Japanese, letters that I couldn't read. When I asked who they were from, she would say, "An old friend," and put them away. Sometimes I would catch her staring out the window, her expression distant, and I knew she was thinking about Japan. about the life she had left behind, about the family she would never see again. It wasn't until after her funeral in 2023 that I learned the truth. My father had died the year before at the age of 101, his mind sharp until the end. My mother followed him a few months later, as if she had been waiting for permission to go. The doctor said it was heart failure, but I think it was something simpler. She was ready. She had lived a long life, had raised a daughter, had built a place for herself in a country that hadn't wanted her. With Warren gone, there was nothing left to keep her here. As I sorted through their belongings, preparing the house for sale, I found a box hidden in the back of her closet. It was a simple cardboard box, the kind you might use for storing old tax records or Christmas decorations. But inside were letters, documents, photographs, and a diary written in Japanese. The diary was small, with a worn leather cover, filled with my mother's careful handwriting. I took the diary to a translator, a Japanese-American woman named Keiko who taught at the local community college. When I explained what I had found, she agreed to translate it for me. It took her several weeks, working through the dense handwriting and the emotional content. What I learned broke my heart and filled it at the same time. The letters Fumiko had been reading all those years were from Isamu. After she left Japan, he had written to her. The first letters were angry, full of recriminations and accusations. But over time, the tone changed. He wrote about his life, about the Japan that was slowly rebuilding itself. He described the new buildings rising from the ruins, the economy recovering, the country finding its way forward. He told her about his own marriage to a woman named Sachiko, a widow with a young son. He told her about the children they had together, a daughter named Yuki and a son named Hiroshi. He wrote about how hard it had been to let go of his anger, how he had carried hatred for years, how it had poisoned his life. But seeing his children grow up, seeing Japan recover, had gradually softened him. "I understand now why you left," he wrote in a letter dated 1955. "You were braver than I was. You chose hope over bitterness, future over past. I am proud of you, sister. I am sorry it took me so long to say that." Fumiko had written back, long letters describing her life in America, her struggles, her triumphs, her daughter. She sent photographs of me at every stage of my life, as a newborn, as a toddler, starting school, graduating high school, getting married, having children of my own. Isamu kept them all. When he died in 1989, his children found the photographs and wrote to Fumiko, telling her that their father had loved her until the end, that he had kept a picture of her on his desk, that he had told them stories about his brave little sister who had crossed the ocean. Fumiko had kept every letter Izumu ever sent her. There were dozens of them, spanning 4 decades, chronicling his life and hers, maintaining a connection across an ocean that neither of them could cross. Reading them, I understood for the first time the depth of my mother's sacrifice. She hadn't just left Japan. She had left a brother she loved, a culture she cherished, a language she thought in, and she had done it knowing she would probably never go back. But the letters weren't the only thing in the box. There were also documents, legal papers, correspondence with government officials. I read through them with growing amazement, piecing together a story my mother had never told. After Fumiko arrived in America, she didn't just focus on building her own life. She became an advocate for other war brides. She wrote letters to immigration officials, highlighting the difficulties that Japanese women faced. She connected with other war brides, forming a network of support. They would meet at each other's homes, sharing advice about navigating American culture, supporting each other through loneliness and discrimination, helping each other with language and legal issues. Fumiko testified through written statements about the need for immigration reform. In one letter dated 1950 and addressed to a congressman, she wrote, "We are not asking for charity. We are asking for fairness. We married American men. We are raising American children. We pay taxes and contribute to our communities. Why should we be treated as less than human because of where we were born? The war is over. Can we not also end the legal discrimination that treats us as permanent enemies?" Her words, and the words of thousands of other war brides, contributed to a growing movement for immigration reform. The presence of these women in American communities, raising families and living ordinary lives, made it harder to maintain the fiction that Asians were unassimilable or dangerous. Their existence was a living argument against racial quotas. Every time a war bride attended a PTA meeting, every time their children played with American kids, every time they contributed to their communities, they were proving that the racist assumptions underlying American immigration law were wrong. In 1952, Congress passed the McCarran-Walter Act, which finally eliminated race as a barrier to immigration and naturalization. It wasn't a perfect law. It still maintained national quotas that heavily favored European immigration, but it was a significant step forward. For the first time since the 1920s, Japanese immigrants could become American citizens. Fumiko applied for citizenship immediately and was naturalized in 1953. I found her naturalization certificate in the box, along with a photograph of her on the day she became a citizen. She was 28 years old, standing in front of an American flag, holding her certificate with both hands. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her eyes, a mixture of relief, pride, and determination. There was also a diary entry from that day. In it, she wrote, "Today I became an American citizen. I swore an oath to this country, and I meant every word. I am grateful for this country that has given me a home, that has allowed me to build a life, that has protected my family. But I will never forget Japan. I carry both countries in my heart. I am Japanese and I am American, and those two things do not contradict each other. I hope that Lorraine will understand that she doesn't have to choose between them. She can be both. That is the gift of her generation, the gift that Warren and I fought to give her." Reading those words, I finally understood my mother. She had carried the weight of two worlds, two identities, two histories. She had never talked about her past because she didn't want me to feel burdened by it. She wanted me to grow up as fully American, without the complications of her struggles, without the weight of her sacrifices. But in doing so, she had also hidden her own heroism. She wasn't just a quiet woman who made good miso soup and volunteered at school. She was a pioneer, one of thousands of women who had crossed impossible barriers, endured prejudice and isolation, and helped change the course of American history. The Japanese war brides didn't set out to be revolutionaries. They just wanted to be with the men they loved and build families in peace. But their presence in America challenged the racial assumptions that had shaped immigration law for decades. They proved that people from different cultures could build lives together, that love could cross the deepest divides, that the categories of enemy and ally were not permanent. By the time the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was passed, eliminating national origin quotas entirely and opening American immigration to people from all over the world, the groundwork had been laid by people like my mother. The war brides had shown that Asian immigrants could and did become part of the American fabric. They had raised children who were undeniably American. They had contributed to their communities. They had proven through their lives that the racist assumptions underlying the old immigration laws were false. My mother never claimed credit for any of this. She lived her life quietly, raising me, supporting my father, volunteering in her community, and keeping her past locked away. But the documents I found told a different story. They showed a woman who had fought, in her own quiet way, for justice and recognition. I also found letters from other war brides, women my mother had helped over the years. There was a letter from a woman named Chieko Sato, who had been my mother's friend from their days working on the military base in Tokyo. Chieko had also married an American soldier and immigrated to the United States. She and my mother had stayed in touch for decades, writing letters, sharing advice, supporting each other through the challenges of life in a foreign country. Chieko wrote in one letter dated 1960, "Do you remember how scared we were on the ship? How we thought we would never belong in America? How we cried at night wondering if we had made a terrible mistake? But we made it, Fumiko. We made lives here. Our children are Americans. We changed this country just by being here, just by refusing to give up, just by insisting on our right to be seen as human beings. That is something to be proud of." My mother had kept that letter for 63 years. There were also letters from my father, written during the months they were separated in 1947. In them, he expressed his frustration with the immigration system, his longing to be reunited with Fumiko, and his determination to fight for her right to join him. In one letter he wrote, "I didn't fight in this war to come home and be told that the woman I love isn't good enough to be an American. I didn't watch my friends die so that bureaucrats could tell me who I can and can't marry. If this country can't see how lucky it would be to have you, then this country needs to change. And I'm going to do everything I can to make that happen. You are worth fighting for, Fumiko. You are worth everything. My father had been part of the fight too. He had written letters, made phone calls, and joined with other servicemen to lobby for changes to immigration law. He had attended meetings, signed petitions, and used his status as a veteran to demand that the government honor its commitment to the men who had served. He had never told me about any of this. Like my mother, he had simply lived his life, raised his family, and kept his activism hidden. I spent weeks going through the box, reading every letter, examining every document, piecing together a story that my parents had never shared with me. I felt anger that they had kept this from me, sadness that I had never known the full truth of their lives, and pride that they had been part of something so important. I also felt a responsibility. My mother's story, and the stories of thousands of other war brides, deserved to be told. They deserved to be remembered not just as wives and mothers, but as women who had shaped history, who had fought for their place in America, who had helped transform the nation's understanding of who could be an American. I started researching the broader history of Japanese war brides. I learned that between 1947 and the early 1960s, approximately 50,000 Japanese women immigrated to the United States as wives of American servicemen. They settled in every state, in big cities and small towns, on military bases and in rural communities. They faced prejudice, isolation, and the enormous challenge of adapting to a culture completely different from their own. Many of them, like my mother, never saw their families in Japan again. International travel was expensive and difficult in the 1950s and 1960s. A plane ticket from the United States to Japan could cost several months' salary for an average family. Many war brides couldn't afford to make the trip, and their families in Japan couldn't afford to visit them. They maintained contact through letters, but the distance was painful, a constant ache that never fully went away. Despite these challenges, the war brides built lives of remarkable resilience. They raised children, many of whom went on to successful careers and contributed to American society in countless ways. They introduced elements of Japanese culture into American communities, from food to art to language. They served as bridges between two nations that had been enemies and helped foster understanding and reconciliation. Their impact on immigration law was profound. The War Brides Act and its amendments created a precedent for family-based immigration, establishing the principle that American citizens had a right to be united with their foreign spouses. This principle became a cornerstone of American immigration policy and paved the way for the more comprehensive reforms of the 1960s. The war brides also challenged American ideas about race and assimilation. At a time when many Americans still believed that Asians could never truly become American, the war brides and their families proved otherwise. They showed that cultural differences could coexist with American identity, that being American didn't mean abandoning one's heritage, that diversity could be a strength rather than a weakness. My mother understood this intuitively. In her diary, she wrote, "I will always be Japanese in my heart, but I am also American. These two things are not contradictions. They are both part of who I am. Lorraine is both Japanese and American, and that is a beautiful thing. The future belongs to people like her, people who carry multiple worlds inside them and see that as strength, not weakness. The future belongs to people who can build bridges instead of walls." As I reflected on my mother's life and the lives of the other war brides, I realized that their story was not just about immigration or legal reform. It was about the power of ordinary people to change the world through their choices and their courage. My mother didn't set out to be a historical figure. She didn't think of herself as an activist or a pioneer. She just wanted to marry the man she loved and build a life with him. But in doing so, she became part of a movement that transformed American society. I also realized that my own life had been shaped by her sacrifices in ways I had never fully appreciated. I grew up as an American, never questioning my right to be here, never facing the legal barriers that my mother had confronted. I was able to pursue education, career, and opportunities that were only possible because my mother had fought for her place in this country, because she and thousands of other war brides had proven that Asian Americans belonged. In 2024, my father passed away at the age of 101. In his final days, he talked about my mother constantly. He told me stories I had never heard before, about their courtship in Tokyo, about the bureaucratic battles they had fought, about the early years of their marriage when they weren't sure they would make it. "Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew," he said, his voice weak but clear. "She left everything behind, came to a country that didn't want her, and built a life through sheer determination. She faced prejudice that would have broken most people, but she never complained. She never gave up. She just kept moving forward, kept being kind, kept believing that things would get better. I was lucky to have her. We were all lucky to have her. After my father died, I decided to write down my mother's story. I translated her diary, organized the letters, and compiled the documents. I contacted historians who specialized in the history of Japanese war brides and shared what I had found. They were amazed by the breadth and detail of my mother's records. One historian, a professor at a university in California, told me, "Your mother's papers are an invaluable primary source. They provide a first-hand account of the war bride experience and the immigration battles of the late 1940s. Most war brides didn't leave detailed records. Many of them were too busy surviving to document their experiences. But your mother saved everything, and her writings give us insight into the emotional and practical challenges these women faced. This is exactly the kind of material we need to fully understand this period of history." I donated copies of the documents to several archives and museums, including the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles and the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I wanted to make sure that my mother's story and the stories of women like her would be preserved for future generations. I also started giving talks about the war brides, sharing my mother's story at community centers, libraries, and schools. I wanted people to understand that immigration history wasn't just about laws and policies. It was about real people, making difficult choices, facing enormous obstacles, and changing the world in the process. At one of these talks, an elderly Japanese-American woman approached me. She was in her 80s, moving slowly with a cane. She told me that her mother had also been a war bride, that she had also faced prejudice and isolation, and that she had also never talked much about her past. "Thank you for telling this story," she said, tears in her eyes. "My mother died 10 years ago, and she never told me most of what she went through. I wish I had asked more questions. I wish I had understood what she sacrificed. I'm glad your mother's story won't be forgotten." That conversation reinforced my sense of mission. There were thousands of war brides, and each of them had a story worth telling. Many of them had died without their children or grandchildren fully understanding what they had accomplished. I wanted to honor their memory by making sure their contributions were recognized. As I continued my research, I discovered that the war bride phenomenon wasn't limited to Japanese women. American servicemen had also married women from Korea, the Philippines, China, and other Asian countries, as well as from Europe. Each group faced its own challenges, but they all shared the experience of crossing cultural boundaries and helping to reshape American society. The Japanese war brides, however, faced unique obstacles because of the depth of anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States after World War II. The fact that they were able to overcome this prejudice and build successful lives is a testament to their resilience and determination. I think about my mother often now. I think about the young woman who left Tokyo in 1947, carrying a single suitcase and a wooden charm from her brother. I think about the challenges she faced, the loneliness she endured, the quiet strength that carried her through. I think about the letters she wrote, the advocacy she engaged in, the difference she made. I wish I had asked her more questions when she was alive. I wish I had understood that her silence about the past wasn't because she had nothing to say, but because she was protecting me from the weight of her struggles. I wish I had told her that I was proud of her, not just as my mother, but as a woman who had changed history. But perhaps she knew, perhaps she saw, in the life I was able to live, the validation of everything she had fought for. I never faced legal barriers because of my race. I never had to prove my right to be American. I was able to move through the world with a freedom that she had helped create. That, I think, is the real legacy of the war brides. They didn't just change immigration law. They changed what it meant to be American. They expanded the definition of who could belong, who could contribute, who could be part of the national story. They did this not through grand gestures or public campaigns, but through the simple act of living their lives with dignity and determination. My mother died in 2023, 76 years after she arrived in America. She was 98 years old. At her funeral, the church was full of people whose lives she had touched, neighbors she had helped, friends she had made, students she had tutored at the library, and community members she had served through decades of volunteer work. Many of them had no idea about her past, about the battles she had fought, about the history she had helped shape, but I knew. And now, through the documents she left behind, the world can know too. Fumiko Nakamura Caldwell was not just my mother. She was a pioneer, an advocate, and a quiet revolutionary. She was one of thousands of women who crossed the Pacific Ocean in the years after World War II and changed America forever. Her story is a reminder that history is made not just by presidents and generals, but by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. It's a reminder that immigration is not just a policy issue, but a human story of courage, sacrifice, and hope. And it's a reminder that the people we think we know best sometimes carry secrets that, when finally revealed, show us that they were even more remarkable than we ever imagined. My mother used to say, "The past is the past," but she was wrong. The past is never past. It lives in us, shapes us, and calls us to honor it by living with the same courage and determination that those who came before us showed. That's what I'm trying to do now. That's what this story is about. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my mother's story. Thank you for remembering the war brides, these women who changed history by simply choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and the future over the past. Their legacy lives on in their children, their grandchildren, and in an America that is richer, more diverse, and more compassionate because they were here. So if you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own family's immigration story. Every story matters. Every voice deserves to be heard. And together, we can make sure that the courage of people like my mother is never forgotten.